My dad chose his gold digger girlfriend over our family, so we kicked him to the curb. A year later, he went broke, and she dumped him the second she found out. He came crawling back to us immediately, but it wasn't to be a family again. When my dad's business first began thriving, I thought it was the greatest thing in the world. We were suddenly able to afford 3 meals a day, and kids in school stopped making fun of me because I no longer wore ripped clothes. Our dad quickly moved us into this much bigger home, where we had our own rooms and hot water all the time. On the outside, everything looked perfect. And at first, I thought it was. Sure, Dad was suddenly super into his image, dressing fancy even around the house and going to events almost every night. I didn't notice how troubling that was until I saw Mom crying one night. Through tears, she told me Dad had canceled their anniversary dinner for some client meeting. I was only 12, but even I knew that was wrong. The real salt in the wound came a few weeks later. Dad had met a girl named Serena during that same client meeting he ditched the anniversary for. Serena was young, gorgeous, and knew exactly how to turn heads. Within weeks, Dad announced he was leaving Mom to marry Serena. Even I flipped out. I yelled at him that Mom was there for him when he had nothing, and that Serena just came along. He couldn't just leave Mom for some shiny Barbie he knew 2 weeks, but he didn't see it that way. He told Mom in front of us that a man of his status needed someone who took care of her body, the way Serena does. I remember feeling so angry, watching Mom cry silently as she packed her bags. Serena moved in with us a few days later, and life became uncomfortable really fast. Serena and Dad always took fancy vacations, leaving me and my siblings alone for weeks at a time with nannies he had hired for full time. When they were home, we barely got any attention. Serena and Dad were always out, horse riding, wine tasting, all the luxuries. We always wanted to join, and Dad always seemed like he was happy, but Serena never let us. It was clear she never liked us. And with how easily Dad was manipulated by her, he always did exactly what she said. What's worse, I could tell the reason Serena hated us was because we cost Dad money. School fees, extracurriculars, it all annoyed her. So much so that she approached me one night and told me flat out to stop stealing his money, that it was for her, not me. I tried to talk to him about it the next day, but he just accused me of hating Serena because she replaced Mom. That's when I knew there was no getting through to him. And then the inevitable happened. With Dad and Serena's lifestyle, it didn't take long before money started getting tight. Their solo vacations downgraded from lavish resorts to budget hotels. The fancy restaurants they once visited almost daily became takeout pizza nights. As expected, Serena didn't handle these changes gracefully. At dinners, she openly mocked Dad for being cheap, or scoffed at the jewelry he bought that was not too cheap. Dad always looked embarrassed, scrambling to keep her happy, constantly apologizing like a wounded puppy. It was around this time that Dad started pulling us from our private schools and canceling our activities. Also, he could spend the money on Serena. My younger sister cried herself to sleep after losing her spot on the gymnastics team. My brother stopped talking altogether, retreating into himself. When I confronted Dad about how much he was hurting us, he barely reacted. His focus was solely on Serena. One evening, as we were having dinner, Dad announced he'd taken money out of our college fund because Serena needed a vacation to de-stress. That's when we knew we couldn't stay. The next day, Mom welcomed us back with open arms. Her house was small, but it felt warm. Our days were simple again, doing homework at the kitchen table, laughing over silly things at dinner. Mom never said a bad word about Dad, but sometimes I saw sadness flash across her face when she thought we weren't looking. A year passed quietly. We didn't hear much from Dad, and honestly, we weren't sure we wanted to. Then, one night, Dad showed up on our doorstep looking like he'd aged 10 years. His clothes were shabby, and his eyes were tired. Mom hesitated, then let him in. He sat on the edge of our worn-out sofa, staring down at his hands. Slowly, he told us everything. He said that in the last year, his business had filed for bankruptcy, and that his money has officially run out. That's when he started crying and calling himself stupid. He admitted that the second he had nothing left, Serena left him. She apparently didn't even comfort him, literally started packing her bags the second he told her. It was honestly heartbreaking to watch our dad like that. By the end of his speech, he was red from crying and embarrassed, and he actually asked for a second chance, not just from us, but from our mom too. He wanted us to be a family again. Mom just sat there quietly for a long time. My sister Emma, 15, was crying silently. My brother Liam, 10, just stared at the floor. I'm 17 now, and I felt so conflicted. Part of me wanted to tell Dad to get lost after everything he'd done. The other part remembered how he used to push me on the swings before all the money stuff. Finally, Mom spoke up. She told Dad he could stay on our couch for a few nights while he figured things out. Not a full reconciliation, just basic human decency. Dad looked relieved, but also kind of disappointed. I think he expected us to welcome him back with open arms. That night was super awkward. Dad tried making small talk during dinner, asking about school and stuff. We gave short answers. Mom kept things civil but distant. After dinner, I helped Mom with dishes, while Dad tried connecting with Emma and Liam in the living room. It wasn't going well from what I could hear. Later, I overheard Mom and Dad talking in the kitchen. Dad was apologizing again, saying how stupid he'd been. Mom wasn't having it. She told him that actions have consequences, and he couldn't just waltz back into our lives expecting everything to be fine. I silently cheered for her. The next morning, I woke up early for school and found Dad already awake, making breakfast. Pancakes, my favorite from when I was little. I could tell he was trying hard, but it felt manipulative somehow, like he thought pancakes could fix years of abandonment. I grabbed a granola bar instead and headed out early. At school, I couldn't focus on anything. My friend Jaden noticed something was up, so I explained the whole situation during lunch. He thought I should give Dad a chance, but he didn't understand. His parents have been happily married forever. When I got home that afternoon, I found Dad fixing the leaky faucet in the bathroom. Mom was at work, and Emma and Liam weren't home yet. It was just us. He tried making conversation, asking about my college plans. I gave short answers while grabbing a snack from the kitchen. Then Dad dropped a bomb. He said he'd been thinking about how to make things right, and he'd found some jewelry of Serena's that she'd left behind. Expensive stuff. He was planning to sell it and put the money toward our college funds. I just stared at him. Part of me was impressed he was trying to make amends. The other part wondered if Serena would come after him when she realized. I didn't say much, just nodded and went to my room to do homework. That night at dinner, Dad announced his plan to everyone. Mom looked concerned and asked if that was even legal. Dad insisted Serena had abandoned the items when she left. Emma seemed hopeful, but Mom wasn't convinced. She pulled Dad aside after dinner for a private conversation. I couldn't help myself. I eavesdropped. Mom was telling Dad he couldn't solve problems by creating new ones. If Serena came after him for the jewelry, it would just make everything worse. Dad got defensive, saying he was just trying to make things right. Their voices got louder until Mom told him to lower his voice because we could hear. The next day was Saturday. Dad suggested we all go to the park like we used to. Mom said she had errands to run, but told us kids we could go if we wanted. Liam actually seemed excited, which surprised me. Emma said she had homework. I reluctantly agreed to go, mostly to keep an eye on Liam. At the park, Dad tried way too hard, pushing Liam on the swings, asking about my friends, buying us ice cream. It was like watching someone follow a How to Dad instruction manual. I kept my responses minimal, but Liam was warming up to him. Then Dad's phone rang. His face changed when he saw who it was. He stepped away to answer, but I could still hear bits of the conversation. It was Serena. She was yelling about her stuff. Dad was trying to calm her down, saying they could talk about it. When he came back, he looked stressed, but tried to act normal. On the way home, Dad got another call, this time from someone named Marcus Delgado. Dad's voice got all nervous as he explained he just needed more time to pay something back. When he hung up, I asked who Marcus was. Dad brushed it off as just business stuff, but I could tell he was lying. When we got home, Mom was waiting with a strange expression. She pulled me aside while Dad was talking to Liam about his video games. She told me a woman had shown up at the house looking for Dad, tall, blonde, and furious. Serena. Mom had told her Dad wasn't living there, just visiting occasionally. Serena hadn't believed her and threatened to come back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dad's phone calls and Serena's visit. Something wasn't adding up. Around midnight, I heard the front door open and close. I peeked out my window and saw Dad hurrying down the street to meet someone in a parked car. They talked for about 10 minutes before Dad came back, looking even more stressed. The next morning at breakfast, Dad announced he had a job interview. Mom looked surprised but supportive. As soon as Dad left, Mom told us she was worried. She'd found a crumpled note in the trash with what looked like gambling debts written on it. The name Marcus Delgado was at the top. I decided to do some digging. While Mom was at the grocery store, I checked Dad's duffel bag that he'd brought with him. Inside, I found a pawn shop receipt for a diamond bracelet, but the amount was way less than what it had to be worth. There was also a threatening text message on his phone from Marcus about collecting what's owed. That's when it hit me. Dad wasn't just broke because Serena spent all his money. He had gambling debts. And now he was trying to use us as a safe haven while he figured out how to pay them off. The whole family reunion thing was just a cover. When Dad got back from his interview, I confronted him in the kitchen. I asked him straight up about Marcus and the gambling. Dad's face went white. He tried denying it at first, then got angry that I'd gone through his stuff. Finally, he broke down and admitted everything. Turns out, as the business started struggling, Dad had turned to gambling to try to save it. He'd lost big, borrowed from some sketchy people, and now they were after him. Serena had left not just because the money ran out, but because these guys had started showing up at their house. Dad had come to us not just for reconciliation, but because he needed a place to hide. The desperation in his eyes as he explained made my stomach turn. I was furious. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. I stormed out of the kitchen and slammed my bedroom door so hard the framed photo of our family vacation, taken before he left us, fell off the wall. the glass cracking across Dad's smiling face. My hands were shaking as I texted Emma to come to my room ASAP. She showed up a minute later, her hair still wet from the shower, concern etched across her face. I told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush of anger and fear. Her face fell as I explained Dad's real situation, her eyes widening when I mentioned Marcus Delgado. We both agreed we needed to tell Mom right away, though I dreaded adding more weight to her already burdened shoulders. Mom got home from her shift at the diner about an hour later. I could hear her keys jangling as she hung them by the door, the familiar sigh as she kicked off her sensible black shoes. We pulled her into her bedroom and spilled everything. She sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress sagging beneath her weight, her face getting paler by the second. When we finished, she just stared at the floor for what felt like forever, absently rubbing the calluses on her hands. Calluses she'd developed working double shifts to support us after Dad left. "I need to talk to your father," she finally said. Her voice was calm, but ice cold. I'd never heard that tone before. It sent shivers down my spine. We followed her to the living room where Dad was watching TV with Liam. Some cartoon was playing, and Liam was laughing, oblivious to the storm about to break. Mom asked Liam to go play in his room for a bit. He looked confused but complied, glancing back at us from the hallway with curious eyes. As soon as he left, Mom unleashed. She didn't yell. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, she spoke in this deadly quiet voice, asking Dad how he could bring this danger to her home, to her children. Each word was precisely chosen and delivered with surgical precision. Dad tried to defend himself, saying these guys weren't actually dangerous, just persistent. The way his eyes darted around the room betrayed his own disbelief in what he was saying. Mom wasn't buying it. She told him he had 24 hours to figure something out, or she was calling the police. Dad begged her not to, saying it would only make things worse, that these weren't the kind of people who responded well to law enforcement involvement. The desperation in his voice made me realize just how deep he was in. That night was the most awkward dinner ever. The only sounds were forks scraping against plates, and Liam's occasional attempts at conversation that quickly died in the frigid atmosphere. Nobody talked. Liam kept looking around, confused about why everyone was so tense, his eyes lingering on Dad's untouched meatloaf. After dinner, I helped Mom with dishes while Dad sat on the couch staring at his phone. I could tell he was panicking, his leg bouncing uncontrollably, his fingers tapping frantically against the screen. Later, I overheard Dad on the phone in the bathroom, trying to keep his voice down. The thin walls of our house made his whispered pleas perfectly audible. He was talking to someone named Keith, begging for a loan. "I know I said that last time, but this is different," he insisted, his voice cracking. "These guys don't mess around, Keith." From what I could make out, Keith wasn't interested in helping. Dad sounded desperate, offering collateral he didn't have, promising returns he couldn't guarantee. When he emerged from the bathroom, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he avoided looking at me as we passed in the hallway. The next morning, Dad was gone before anyone woke up. The house felt eerily quiet, without his nervous energy filling the spaces. He left a note saying he was meeting with an old business contact who might be able to help. The handwriting was shaky, some words crossed out and rewritten. Mom just shook her head when she read it, her lips pressed into a thin line of disbelief. She called in sick to work and spent the morning making calls to a lawyer friend for advice, pacing the kitchen with a cup of coffee that grew cold in her hands. Around noon, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tense silence like a knife. Mom looked through the peephole, and her whole body tensed up, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the doorframe. She told us to go to our rooms, her voice leaving no room for argument. I pretended to go but doubled back and hid around the corner, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Mom opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain on, her body positioned to block any view into our home. It was Serena. Even from my hiding spot, I could see she looked different than I remembered. Less polished, more frantic. Her designer clothes seemed rumpled, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She demanded to know where Dad was, saying he had taken things that belonged to her. Mom told her Dad wasn't there and tried to close the door, but Serena stuck her foot in, the pointed toe of her expensive boot preventing the door from shutting. "He pawned my tennis bracelet," Serena hissed, her voice carrying the raspy edge of someone who'd been crying or yelling or both. "That was worth 20 grand, and he got what, 3 for it? I want the rest of my stuff before he sells that too." Her manicured nails gripped the edge of the door, red polish chipped and uneven. Mom told her to take it up with Dad and tried again to close the door. Serena pushed harder, her desperation matching Dad's in a way that made me realize they were both drowning in the same mess. Those people he owes money to? They think I'm involved. They followed me yesterday. Do you understand what kind of people these are? Fear made her voice crack, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. That's when I stepped out from my hiding spot. I couldn't help myself. The need to know exactly what danger we were in overpowered my promise to stay hidden. I asked Serena exactly who these people were. Mom shot me a look that mixed anger with fear, but Serena actually answered, perhaps relieved to have someone else acknowledge the gravity of the situation. Your dad got involved with Marcus Delgado. He runs an underground poker game downtown, out of the back room of that Italian restaurant on 4th Street. Your brilliant father thought he could win big. Instead, he lost everything and borrowed more. Marcus doesn't do payment plans. She laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and frightening. He does broken fingers and slashed tires as reminders. Mom finally managed to close the door, but not before Serena shouted that she'd be back with the police if her stuff wasn't returned. Mom leaned against the door, looking completely drained, the lines around her eyes deeper than I'd ever noticed before. "Pack an overnight bag," she told me, her voice steady, despite the fear I could see in her eyes. "We're staying at Aunt Carol's tonight." She didn't need to explain why. The threat in Serena's voice had made it clear our home might not be safe anymore. I texted Emma, who was at her friend's house, telling her to meet us at Aunt Carol's. Mom called Liam in from the backyard, where he'd been building a fort with the lawn chairs, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding. Within an hour, we were in the car heading across town, the trunk loaded with hastily packed bags. Mom left Dad a note telling him where we'd be and why, her handwriting much steadier than his had been. Aunt Carol was Mom's older sister. She lived in a small apartment on the other side of town, in a building with a security door and cameras in the lobby, features that seemed suddenly important. She welcomed us with open arms, though she looked concerned when Mom explained the situation, her eyebrows knitting together as she glanced at us kids. That night, we all crammed into her tiny living room, Liam and I on the pull-out couch that squeaked with every movement, Emma on an air mattress that slowly deflated throughout the night, and Mom sharing Aunt Carol's room. The unfamiliar shadows on the ceiling kept me awake, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Around midnight, Mom's phone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet apartment. It was Dad. I pretended to be asleep, but listened to Mom's side of the conversation, her whispered words carrying clearly in the small space. Dad was panicking because we weren't home. Mom told him we were safe and that he needed to fix his mess without putting us in danger. "No, I'm not telling you where we are right now," she said firmly. "Not until I know it's safe." When she hung up, I heard her crying softly, muffled sobs that she was trying to hide from us. It was the first time I'd heard her cry since Dad left us 3 years ago. The next morning, Mom sat us all down and explained that we'd be staying with Aunt Carol for a few days, until Dad sorted things out. Liam started crying, asking if the bad men were going to hurt Dad. His small face crumpled in fear, reminding me how young he still was, too young to understand the complexity of what was happening. Mom hugged him and said Dad was going to be fine, but I could tell she wasn't sure. The way she avoided Emma's eyes told me everything I needed to know about how serious this was. Later that day, Dad showed up at Aunt Carol's. I was surprised he'd found us, but Mom later explained she'd texted him our location after he called sounding desperate and afraid. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, wearing the same clothes as yesterday. Aunt Carol reluctantly let him in, but stood with her arms crossed the whole time, her protective stance making it clear she blamed him for putting her sister and nieces and nephew in this position. Dad told us he had a plan to fix everything. He'd reached out to his old business partner, Trevor, who had agreed to loan him enough to pay off Marcus. Trevor had been the sensible one when they ran the business together, the one who cautioned against expansion before they were ready. Dad should have listened to him then. Mom asked how he planned to pay Trevor back, her tone skeptical. Dad said he'd gotten a job at Trevor's new company. It wasn't glamorous, basically starting over at the bottom, but it was legitimate work with a steady paycheck. Mom seemed skeptical, but slightly relieved, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Just as things were calming down, Dad's phone rang. The generic ringtone seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. His face fell when he saw who it was, color draining away once again. He stepped into the hallway to answer, but we could all hear him anyway. The walls in Aunt Carol's apartment were even thinner than ours. It was Marcus, and he wasn't happy. Dad kept saying he'd have the money tomorrow, just one more day. His voice took on a pleading quality that made me cringe. When he came back in, he looked like he might throw up, his hands visibly trembling as he shoved the phone back in his pocket. "They know I'm here," he said quietly. "I need to go." His eyes darted to the window, checking the parking lot below. That's when I lost it. Years of bottled-up resentment exploded out of me. I told Dad he was putting all of us in danger because of his stupid mistakes. My voice rose with each word, cracking with emotion. I reminded him how he'd abandoned us for Serena, leaving us struggling while he played house with his new girlfriend, and now he was dragging us into his gambling mess. Mom tried to calm me down, placing a restraining hand on my arm, but years of hurt came pouring out. I told Dad I wished he'd never come back into our lives. The words hung in the air, impossible to take back. The look on his face was gut-wrenching, a mixture of shame and pain that made me immediately regret my outburst. But I was too angry to apologize, too hurt to take it back. He nodded slowly, apologized to everyone, and left, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mom followed him into the hallway. I couldn't hear what they said, but when she came back, her eyes were red, and she wouldn't look at me directly. That night, I couldn't sleep. The pull-out couch felt even more uncomfortable, every spring digging into my back. I kept thinking about Dad out there somewhere, possibly in danger. Despite everything, he was still my dad, the one who taught me to ride a bike, who came to every school play before he left us. Around 2 a.m., I checked my phone and saw a text from him. "I'm sorry for everything. I love you kids more than you'll ever know." The timestamp showed it had come in an hour earlier. It read like a goodbye note. I panicked and woke Mom up, showing her the text. She immediately tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. She called again and again with the same result, her movements becoming more frantic with each failed attempt. Finally, she called the police to report him as potentially Sewers Lytle. They took the information but didn't seem particularly concerned. "Adults go off-grid all the time," the officer said, his voice bored, "especially when they're having financial troubles." The next morning, we still hadn't heard from Dad. Mom was beside herself, pacing Aunt Carol's small living room, calling everyone she could think of who might know where Dad had gone. She called Trevor, whose number she found in Dad's old contacts, scrolling through a phone he'd left behind years ago. Trevor hadn't seen or heard from Dad since yesterday afternoon. He confirmed that he had offered Dad a job and a loan, but Dad needed to come sign paperwork today. "Tell him to call me," Trevor said. "The offer still stands." Mom decided to go look for Dad. Aunt Carol stayed with us kids while Mom drove around checking places Dad might go. His old office building, the park where he used to take us on weekends, even driving past Serena's house to see if his car was there. She came back hours later, exhausted and worried. No sign of him anywhere. She'd even checked the hospital, afraid he might have done something desperate. Around dinner time, there was a knock at the door. The sound made us all freeze. Aunt Carol checked the peephole and quickly stepped back, her face pale. It was Marcus, a tall guy with slicked back hair and an expensive-looking jacket. He had another guy with him, bigger and meaner-looking, with a tattoo creeping up his neck. Aunt Carol told us to go to the bedroom while she called the police. We huddled together on her bed, Liam clinging to Emma, while I pressed my ear against the door to hear what was happening. From the bedroom, we could hear Marcus shouting through the door that he just wanted to talk, that Dad owed him money. "I know he's staying here," he yelled, his voice muffled but clearly angry. "This doesn't have to get complicated." The police arrived surprisingly quickly, their sirens audible from blocks away. We heard them talking to Marcus, telling him to leave or be arrested for harassment. Marcus and his friend eventually left, but not before shouting that this wasn't over. The threat lingered in the air long after they were gone. The police officers came in to take a statement. Mom explained the situation, including that Dad was missing. They seemed more concerned now, taking down all the details and promising to keep an eye out for him. One officer, a woman with kind eyes, gave Mom her direct number. "Call me if he contacts you," she said, "or if those men come back." That night was tense. We all jumped at every sound. Car doors slamming in the parking lot, voices in the hallway, the building's heating system kicking on with a clank. Mom barely slept, constantly checking her phone. I caught her looking at old family photos on her phone, tears silently tracking down her face. The next morning, she got a call from the police. They'd found Dad's car abandoned in a parking lot near the river. My heart dropped. We all feared the worst. Images of Dad jumping into the cold, dark water flashing through my mind. Mom left immediately to go to the police station, her hands shaking so badly she dropped her keys twice before making it out the door. Aunt Carol tried to keep us distracted with board games and movies, but it was useless. We were all thinking the same thing. What if Dad had done something terrible to himself? What if my last words to him had pushed him over the edge? The guilt was suffocating. Hours later, Mom returned looking both relieved and furious. Dad was alive. The police had found him sleeping in a cheap motel across town, his phone battery dead, charger left behind in his haste to leave Aunt Carol's. He'd turned off his phone before it died because he was afraid Marcus would track him. When the police told him how worried we all were, he broke down crying, begging them to tell us he was okay. Dad came back to Aunt Carol's with Mom. He looked awful, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, and he needed a shower, but he was alive. He apologized over and over for scaring us. Then he told us his new plan. Trevor had come through with the loan. Dad had the money to pay off Marcus. He was going to meet him tonight at a public place to make the exchange. As he explained, his hands kept fidgeting with his wallet, pulling it out and putting it back, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood. Mom immediately shot this down. She told Dad he needed to go through proper channels, maybe get a lawyer involved or have the police present for the exchange. Dad insisted this was the only way. Guys like Marcus didn't do lawyers or paper trails. They operated in cash and threats. After a long argument, during which Aunt Carol took Liam to get ice cream to spare him the tension, they compromised. Dad would meet Marcus, but in a very public place, the food court at the mall, and Mom would be nearby watching, ready to call the police at the first sign of trouble. I insisted on coming too. The thought of staying behind, not knowing what was happening, was unbearable. After some back and forth, they agreed I could come but had to stay far away with Aunt Carol while Mom watched from a closer distance. Emma and Liam would stay at Aunt Carol's apartment with her neighbor, keeping an eye on them. Emma protested, wanting to come too, but Mom was firm. "One child in potential danger is already too many," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. That evening, we put the plan into action. The mall was busy with after-work shoppers, providing the crowd Dad had hoped for. He sat at a table in the busy food court, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him, while Mom watched from a table about 30 feet away, pretending to be absorbed in her phone. Aunt Carol and I positioned ourselves near the entrance, pretending to shop, but keeping an eye on everything. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. Marcus showed up right on time, alone, thankfully. He looked more normal than I expected. He could have been any businessman in his crisp shirt and slacks. He sat down across from Dad. From our position, I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Dad sliding an envelope across the table. Marcus counted the contents, nodded, and stood up. It seemed like it was over, the nightmare finally ending. I felt myself starting to breathe again. Then Serena appeared out of nowhere, like she'd been waiting and watching too. She must have followed Dad from Aunt Carol's apartment, knowing he'd be meeting Marcus. She marched right up to their table and started yelling at Dad. I couldn't hear the words, but her face was red with anger, her hands gesturing wildly. Marcus looked annoyed at the scene she was causing, glancing around as people started to stare. Dad tried to calm her down, his hands raised in a placating gesture, but she wasn't having it. She kept pointing at the envelope Marcus was now tucking into his jacket. Mall security started heading their way, a heavy-set man in a uniform moving with surprising speed. Marcus quickly left, disappearing into the crowd before security arrived. Dad and Serena were still arguing when the security guard reached them. I watched as Dad tried to explain the situation, but Serena was making a huge scene now, drawing attention from everyone around. A small crowd had gathered, some people openly filming with their phones. Mom rushed over to intervene. I couldn't help myself. I followed, ignoring Aunt Carol calling after me. By the time I reached them, Mom was trying to get between Dad and Serena. Serena was demanding her jewelry back, saying Dad had stolen it. "You took everything from me," she shouted, mascara running down her cheeks. "My jewelry, my savings, my reputation." The security guard asked them all to leave. As we walked toward the exit, Serena kept following, getting louder and more aggressive with each step. In the parking lot, she grabbed Dad's arm, spinning him around with surprising strength. That's when she noticed the empty envelope sticking out of his pocket, the one that had held the money for Marcus. The streetlights illuminated her face as realization dawned. "You had money this whole time?" she shrieked. "You told me you were broke. You owe me." Her voice echoed across the nearly empty parking lot. She lunged for the envelope. Dad tried to stop her, and they struggled, their movements jerky and desperate. Mom tried to separate them, pulling at Serena's arm. In the chaos, Serena lost her balance and fell, hitting her head on the pavement with a sickening crack. She wasn't moving, a small pool of blood forming beneath her blonde hair. Everything happened so fast after that. Mom called 911 while Dad checked on Serena. She was conscious but dazed, blinking up at the night sky in confusion. The paramedics arrived and took her to the hospital, carefully stabilizing her neck before moving her. The police came too and took statements from everyone. They seemed satisfied it was an accident, but told Dad they might need to speak with him again. One officer eyed him suspiciously throughout the questioning, making notes that seemed longer than necessary. We all went back to Aunt Carol's, shaken by the whole experience. Dad was a mess, convinced he was going to be arrested for assault or something. He kept replaying the moment, insisting he never meant for her to fall. Mom assured him the security cameras would show it was an accident. "There are cameras all over that parking lot," she said, rubbing his back like she used to do when I had nightmares as a child. "They'll see what really happened." The next day, Dad got a call from the hospital. Serena was fine, just a mild concussion and a few stitches where her head had hit the pavement. She'd told the police she didn't want to press charges. Dad was relieved but suspicious. It wasn't like Serena to let something go, especially when she could use it to her advantage. He paced Aunt Carol's living room, waiting for the other shoe to drop. We found out why later that day when Serena showed up at Aunt Carol's. She had a bandage on her head and a smug look on her face. She had somehow gotten our location from someone, probably by following us from the hospital. She told Dad she wouldn't press charges or tell Marcus about the incident on one condition. Dad had to sign over his car to her. It was the last valuable thing he owned, a BMW he'd kept even as everything else was sold off or repossessed. Dad was cornered and he knew it. He agreed to her terms, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Mom was furious, saying Serena was blackmailing him, but Dad just wanted it all to be over. He signed the transfer papers Serena had already prepared, the pen shaking slightly in his hand, and she left with his car keys, looking triumphant. Through the window, we watched her slide into the driver's seat of Dad's car, adjusting the mirrors before driving away with a screech of tires. That night, Dad sat us all down for a family meeting. He admitted he'd made terrible mistakes, choosing Serena over our family, gambling away his business, and then dragging us into his mess. His voice broke as he apologized, years of poor decisions finally catching up to him. He promised to do better, to earn back our trust. He was starting his new job at Trevor's company next week, and he'd be paying Mom back for all the child support he'd missed. "I know words are cheap," he said, looking each of us in the eye, "but I'm going to show you with actions from now on." Mom wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but she agreed to let him stay on our couch until he found his own place. It was a start, a small olive branch extended after years of hurt. Liam was thrilled, immediately asking if Dad could take him to the park tomorrow. Emma was more reserved, but I saw her smile slightly when Dad offered to help with her homework. The next few weeks were awkward, but gradually improved. Dad went to work every day at his new job, leaving early and coming home late. He came home tired, but seemed satisfied to be doing honest work again. He gave Mom most of his first paycheck for back child support, keeping only enough for a bus pass and lunches. He spent time with Liam playing video games, helped Emma with her science project, and even asked about my college applications. Small steps toward rebuilding what he'd broken. One evening, about a month after the mall incident, Dad and I were alone in the kitchen. He was washing dishes while I finished homework at the table, the familiar domestic scene almost making it feel like he'd never left. Out of nowhere, he told me he was proud of me for standing up to him when he came back, for protecting the family. He said I was stronger than he ever was. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was still angry, the hurt too deep to be erased by a few weeks of good behavior. But another part recognized he was really trying, putting in the work every day to make amends. I finally asked the question that had been bothering me for years. Why wasn't our family enough for him? Why did he need Serena and all that flashy stuff? The question had burned inside me since the day he walked out. Dad dried his hands and sat down across from me. The kitchen light highlighted the new gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He explained that growing up poor had left him with a hole he thought money would fill. When the business took off, he got caught up in proving he wasn't that poor kid anymore. Serena had seemed like the perfect accessory to his new life. Beautiful, sophisticated, everything his insecurities told him he should want. The fancy car, the expensive restaurants, the designer clothes, all of it was armor against his own feelings of inadequacy. But it was all empty, he said, his eyes fixed on the table between us. None of it made me happy. I was just too stubborn to admit I'd made a mistake. He looked up at me then, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Leaving you kids was the worst thing I've ever done. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it, if you'll let me." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my real dad, not the fake version who'd abandoned us, or the desperate man who'd shown up on our doorstep a month ago. The next day, Dad got a call from Marcus. My heart stopped when Dad mentioned who it was, but the call wasn't what we expected. Marcus wanted to offer Dad a legitimate job at his new restaurant. Apparently, Marcus had been impressed by Dad's determination to pay his debt, and he needed a manager he could trust. "You're the kind of guy who keeps his word," Marcus had said, according to Dad. That's rare these days. Dad turned it down politely, saying he was committed to his job with Trevor. When he hung up, he looked relieved, like he'd passed some kind of test. He told us he was done taking shortcuts. The slow, honest path was the only way forward. Mom looked skeptical, but nodded approvingly. That night, as we all sat around the dinner table, I looked at my family. Mom tired from work, but smiling as she passed the potatoes. Emma talking animatedly about her school play. Liam actually eating vegetables without complaint. And Dad, humbled but present, listening intently to Emma's story. It wasn't perfect. There was still hurt and trust to rebuild. Dad would need to prove himself day after day, and there would be setbacks along the way. But for the first time in years, it felt like we might actually be okay. Not the same as before. That was impossible. But maybe something new and, eventually, something good. 2 months passed pretty quickly after that. Dad kept his word about the job with Trevor. He was working his A's off, sometimes doing 12-hour days just to prove himself. Every Friday, he'd hand Mom an envelope with money for child support and bills. At first, she tried refusing it, saying he should save for his own place, but he insisted. "I owe you guys way more than this," he'd say, and leave it on the kitchen counter. The couch situation wasn't ideal for anyone. Dad's back was killing him, and our living room always smelled like his aftershave. Mom started looking at 2-bedroom apartments nearby that might be more affordable than our current place. "The kids could share," she'd say, not directly mentioning where Dad would fit in this plan. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs to find Dad making pancakes again. This time, I actually ate them. They were pretty good, even if the edges were a little burnt. We sat at the kitchen table together while everyone else was still sleeping. "I found an apartment," he said between bites. "It's not far from here. Just a studio, but it's clean." I nodded, feeling weirdly disappointed. Part of me had gotten used to having him around again. I was thinking maybe you kids could come over sometimes, if you want. No pressure. He was trying to sound casual, but I could tell it mattered to him. Yeah, maybe, I said, suddenly super interested in the syrup patterns on my plate. Dad moved out the following weekend. Liam cried a little, which made Dad get all misty-eyed too. Emma pretended not to care, but I caught her giving him a quick hug when she thought no one was looking. Mom helped him load his few belongings into Trevor's truck. They talked quietly by the front door for a long time before he left. Dad's apartment was exactly as depressing as I'd expected. One room with a kitchenette in the corner, a bathroom smaller than our closet at home, and a mattress on the floor. He'd hung up a few family photos and had a sad-looking plant by the window. But he seemed proud of it when we visited, like it represented his fresh start or something. The first real test came when Emma's birthday rolled around in April. Dad asked if he could come to her party. Mom left it up to Emma, who shrugged and said, "Whatever, it's fine." Not exactly enthusiastic, but Dad was thrilled. He showed up with a wrapped gift and a cake from the fancy bakery Emma loved. The cake must have cost him at least half a day's wages. The party was awkward at first. Mom's friends kept giving Dad these looks, like they were waiting for him to screw up. Aunt Carol barely spoke to him, but Dad just kept his head down, helped set up games, and stayed out of the way. By the end of the night, things had loosened up a bit. I even saw Mom laugh at something Dad said while they were cleaning up. Emma's gift from Dad was a set of expensive art supplies. She'd been into painting lately, covering her side of our shared room with watercolor landscapes. The look on her face when she opened it, surprise followed by genuine happiness, was the first time I'd seen her drop her guard around Dad since he came back. "How did you know?" she asked, running her fingers over the brushes. "I pay attention," Dad said simply. After that, Emma started texting Dad about her art projects. Small steps. Summer came, and with it, my graduation. I'd managed to get a partial scholarship to state, which was a huge relief. College had seemed impossible when Dad first left, and Mom was struggling to keep us fed. Now it was actually happening. Dad insisted on buying my cap and gown, even though Mom had already budgeted for it. "Let me do this," he told her. "Please." The graduation ceremony was hot and boring, like they always are, but looking out from the stage and seeing my whole family there, Mom, Emma, Liam, Dad, Aunt Carol, even Trevor, who'd become kind of a friend to all of us, made all those late nights studying worth it. Dad took us all out for dinner afterward. Nothing fancy, just the local diner, but he paid for everyone. I noticed he only ordered coffee for himself. Later, I overheard Trevor telling him to eat something, that he couldn't keep skipping meals to save money. Dad just shrugged it off. That night, Dad gave me an envelope. Inside was $500 in cash. "It's not much for college," he said, looking embarrassed. "But it's a start. I'm going to send more every month." I knew how hard he'd worked for that money, how many hours he'd put in at the warehouse, lifting boxes and taking inventory for barely above minimum wage. It meant more than if he'd handed me a credit card back in his Serena days. "Thanks, Dad," I said, and I actually meant it. The real surprise came a week later. Mom sat us all down in the living room, looking nervous. Dad was there too, which was weird since it wasn't his usual visit day. "Your father and I have been talking," she started, glancing at Dad. "We've decided to try dating again." Emma's jaw literally dropped. Liam started bouncing on the couch like he'd just been told we were going to Disneyland. I just sat there, not sure how to feel. "We're taking it very slow," Dad added quickly. "One step at a time." "Like super slow," Mom emphasized. "We're not making any promises." But I could see something in the way they looked at each other. Something that had been missing for years, even before Dad left us for Serena. Their first date was painfully awkward. Dad showed up with flowers, wearing a tie that didn't match his shirt. Mom spent 2 hours getting ready, changing outfits like 5 times. They went to a movie and dinner, the most basic date possible. When Mom came home, her cheeks were flushed, and she couldn't stop smiling. "It was nice," was all she would say when Emma pressed for details. They kept dating through the summer, once a week, usually on Fridays. Sometimes they'd bring Liam along, making it more of a family thing. Dad started coming over for dinner more often, staying to help with dishes and homework. He and Mom would talk in the kitchen long after we'd gone to bed, their voices a low, comforting murmur through the walls. In August, just before I left for college, we had a family meeting. Dad announced he'd been promoted at work. He was now managing the warehouse inventory, which came with better hours and a decent raise. Mom revealed she'd been taking online classes to become a medical billing specialist, which would mean a better job once she finished. "We've been thinking," Mom said, looking at Dad for confirmation. "What if we got a bigger place? Something with enough room for everyone." "Including Dad?" Liam asked, his eyes wide with hope. "Including Dad," Mom confirmed. "If that's okay with all of you." Emma looked at me, waiting for my reaction. As the oldest, they were all following my lead. I thought about everything that had happened. Dad leaving us for Serena, the years of struggling, his return when he had nowhere else to go, the gambling debts, the Marcus situation, and then the slow, steady months of him proving himself day after day. Yeah, I finally said. That's okay with me. The relief on Dad's face was almost painful to see. We found a 4-bedroom house for rent not far from our current place. It wasn't fancy. The kitchen needed updating and the backyard was basically a patch of dirt, but it had enough space for all of us. Dad and Mom would have the master bedroom. Emma and Liam would each get their own rooms for the first time ever, and I'd have a room for when I came home from college on breaks. Moving day was chaos. Trevor brought his truck again, and Aunt Carol helped pack boxes. Even Marcus showed up for an hour, bringing pizza for everyone and helping Dad move the heavy furniture. Seeing them chat like normal people was surreal after everything that had happened. As I was carrying boxes to my new room, I overheard Dad talking to Mom in the kitchen. They didn't know I was there. "I don't deserve this second chance," he said quietly. "I know that." "No, you don't," Mom agreed, her voice gentle but honest. "But you've earned it." I slipped away before they noticed me, feeling like I'd witnessed something private. That night, our first in the new house, we ordered Chinese food and ate it picnic style on the living room floor since we hadn't set up the dining table yet. Liam was excitedly planning how he'd decorate his room, and Emma was already sketching ideas for a mural on her wall that Mom had surprisingly agreed to. Dad kept looking around at all of us like he couldn't believe his luck. The doorbell rang around 8 p.m. Dad went to answer it, then called for Mom. Their voices were hushed, but I could tell something was up. I peeked into the hallway and saw Serena standing in our doorway. My stomach dropped. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, her clothes less flashy. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "I just wanted to drop this off," she was saying, handing Dad an envelope. "It's what I got for the car. I know it doesn't make up for everything, but—" Dad looked stunned. "You sold the BMW?" Serena nodded. "I'm moving to Portland. Fresh start." She glanced past him and saw me watching. For a second, our eyes met, and I saw something like regret there. Then she turned and walked away. Dad closed the door slowly, staring at the envelope in his hands. "What was that about?" Mom asked. "I think," Dad said slowly, "that was an apology." He opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for way more than the car was worth, along with a short note. Dad read it silently, then passed it to Mom. She read it, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "Well," she said finally, "people can change." Dad put the check in his wallet. "This is going straight into the kids' college funds," he said firmly, "where it should have been all along." Later that night, I helped Dad assemble my bed frame. We worked mostly in silence, the instructions spread out on the floor between us. It reminded me of when I was little, and we'd build Lego sets together on rainy days. "You know," I said, tightening a bolt, "I never thought we'd be here. Like this." Dad paused, screwdriver in hand. "Me neither," he admitted. "I thought I'd lost you guys forever, and I would have deserved it." I shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with the serious turn. "Yeah, well, you're not completely terrible now, I guess." He laughed, the tension breaking. High praise from a teenager. "I'm 18 now," I reminded him. "Technically an adult. God help us all," he joked. But his eyes were serious when he added, "I'm really proud of you, you know. All of you. But especially you. You held this family together when I couldn't." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just handed him another screw. The next morning, I woke up early to finish packing for college. My room was still mostly in boxes, but my bed was made, and Dad had hung up my high school graduation picture on the wall. Through the window, I could see him in the backyard with Liam, marking out space for a garden Mom wanted to plant. Emma came in without knocking, as usual. "Mom's making pancakes," she said, sitting on my bed. "Dad's showing Liam how to build a raised garden bed." "Cool," I said, folding a t-shirt. "Are you okay?" she asked suddenly. "With all of this? Mom and Dad, the new house, everything?" I thought about it for a minute. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think I am." "Me too," she admitted. "It's weird, but good weird." We went downstairs together. The kitchen smelled like coffee and pancakes, and Mom was humming as she flipped them on the griddle. Dad and Liam came in from outside, dirt on their hands and matching grins on their faces. As we all sat down to eat, I realized this was what normal felt like. Not perfect, not a fairy tale ending, but solid and real. Dad caught my eye across the table and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. I smiled back. Yeah, we were going to be okay.